is Dr. Zaman S. Stanizai, who's a professor of mythological studies at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, one of those beautifully situated campuses I know of anywhere. He also teaches political science at California State University in Dominguez Hills. He has a doctorate in political science from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles and a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Washington in Seattle. As a Fulbright scholar, he has worked in Indo-Iranian languages, and his postdoctoral studies have been in Islamic mysticism and depth and sacred psychology. As a published poet, Dr. Stanizai explores beauty in the depth of thought expressed in his Pashto and Dari Persian poetry, where his modern perspective emulates the classical style of Rumi, Hafiz, Rahman Baba, Baqir, and Iqbal. He writes on the politicization of ethnic, national, and religious identities as a contributing factor in regional and world conflicts. Dr. Stanizai writes for the Middle East Institute, blogs in Huffington Post, and writes his own websites, stanizai.org and stanizai.com. And he is speaking to us today about robbing the Arab Spring of political legitimacy. Thank you.
Following the beautiful lines of poetry that cannot be matched, but I think there is a kind of culturally translated poem from Arabic into English, which reads, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but would a spring by any other name be as uplifting and growing and expanding as life is? Not if you measure it by what's happening in the Arab Spring, which perhaps is a misnomer on both accounts of being neither." The discussion that I'm going to dwell on primarily here is that why is the Arab Spring not a spring, and perhaps not so much an Arab in its entity? And this has to do with the theoretical framework would be based on the notion that how come the resource-rich geographic Arab center has become the economic periphery, and I'm building on the paradigms that were established by Paul Baran on dependency, Emmanuel Wallerstein on the center-periphery concept of the global system, for those of you who do research in political science. And I think it touches a little bit also on Rosa Luxemburg's concept of imperial state. But I'm centering primarily this on the very classical notion that free trade and fair trade are running sort of the opposite end of this equation. Once the fair trade becomes free trade, then it's not fair. And the main notion there becomes profit maximization. And that affects the Arab Spring in several ways, because primarily there's a conflict of interest between the parties that want to bring change, which is the Arab East, and the parties who have other interests, which is primarily the West, and how the conflict evolves. This centers on several things. First, in politically speaking, if we are talking about profit maximization, then we have to make sure we control the other end as much as possible. And it's for that reason that we want to make sure that first there are no revolutions, but we couldn't stop that. Second, if there were, to make sure that there is sort of a soft landing for the dictators we had appointed. And there were many calls for them to remain in power. And this was not by the media, but by sort of quote-unquote the officialdom here in the West. The conflicts that primarily did not come to surface is that the Arab Springs did not remain Arab. If you make a contrast between what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, is that everyone was celebrating the freedom of the East Europeans or Central Europeans. There were celebrations that these revolutions were successful, that the dictators were falling one after another, and sort of the world was free. And contrast that with how we reacted towards the quote-unquote the Arab Spring, is that at every turn there were reasons offered that stability is more important, that drastic changes, quote-unquote revolutions, may not be the only alternative, and so on and so forth. So, but why the hesitance? And the hesitance is that because, at least from the economic standpoint, the countries that are resource rich, and if we are eyeing their resources, we could only get their resources through dictatorships, because it's difficult to do that through democracies. Because in democracies, people claim their own wealth theirs, and only through dictatorships we can claim them as ours or equally ours. And we also talk, at least from the Western perspective, about their resources as though we have a kind of, through a sense of entitlement, that these are, let's say, at least for the United States, these are American interests. What is presented as American interest is, in reality, American corporate interest. Because as far as the average consumer is concerned, we depend on Middle Eastern, primarily Saudi oil, for only 12% of our imports. So a huge chunk of our imports come from elsewhere, from Canada, from Mexico, from Venezuela and elsewhere, but not from the Middle East. But it's presented as though that is our lifeline, and we must defend it and we must protect it. And of course, we send armies and troops to make sure it stays that way. It's in this context that the whole Arab Spring is defined on where it is allowed to occur and where it's not. As the argument has always been made that if Arabs didn't have oil, we would allow their democracy. But the complexities are kind of, even the media pushes it, under the rug to kind of hide it. Remember, there was an intervention in Libya. What in reality was happening was that Libya signed a $6 billion trade agreement with France, but when there was a defection by a high intelligence officer from Libya, and the Libyan government demanded his return, France denied. And when France didn't return their intelligence officer, Gaddafi canceled the $6 billion trade agreement. When this happened, France said, oh yeah, Gaddafi has to leave the political scene, and the French, Navy sent, I think it was Charles de Gaulle, the name of the ship, and they started bombing, and everything started, and the whole thing was because of that. But this would not have happened unless they had gotten also an approval from some of the Arab states. Well, how did we get that? Well, when the West decided to intervene, the Arab states objected. But then a trade was made. The United States made a tit-for-tat agreement with Saudi Arabia, that because Saudi Arabia did not want any revolution not just on its own soil, of course, but not even in the whole of Arabian Peninsula. So the deal was that Saudi Arabia would convince enough states within the Arab Union to allow the West to intervene in Libya if the United States allows Saudi Arabia to intervene in Bahrain. Good deal. So Bahrain was invaded by the Saudis, Libya was invaded by the French and the Americans, and voila, you got another version of revolution there. The other factors in terms of how, from the colonial period up to now, how it translates politically is that the position of the State of Israel, where we put Israel's security in many cases even above our own. I think what most analysts forget is that in reality there are two Israels. One is Israel, the dream homeland of the Jews, that they aspire to have one, like all other people want to. We won't get to the controversial part of it. That's one thing. But the other function that the State of Israel has, which is often overlooked, is that Israel is actually the colonial outpost for the West in the heart of the Middle East. So Israel divides the Muslim East both geographically, by where it's located, but also politically. I think a lot of Israelis don't know that either. And what happened is that in the process, Israel also becomes the punching bag for the resentment of the Arabs, which would have, in the classical colonial context, that anger would have been directed towards the West, France, England, maybe the United States. But now it's directed towards, like I said, the colonial outpost right there. So Israel gets that anger on top of whatever else that the socio-political conflicts bring about. Then we also go into the context of Islam being a threat. And that dimension is looked at in a way, again, the media and the State Department and, of course, politicians in Western Europe collaborate on this in the following way. If you take the Egyptian election, for instance, they portrayed two parties, the Salafists and the Brotherhood, to be the extreme religion or religious-oriented parties. The policy generally has been, since the 19th century, is that the Salafist or the Wahhabis from Saudi Arabia is a regressive party. They want to reform the Muslim society based on a model of what state the Prophet had created in Medina back in 622. That is their model. So that, in a sense, to put it a little simplistically, they want to go back 14 centuries to create an ideal state, and not realizing that the Medina model may or may not apply in terms of the size of the state and all that. Whereas the Muslim Brotherhood comes from another movement, which is the Pan-Islamism movement that started in the 19th century in Afghanistan and spread throughout the Muslim world, and it was spearheaded by Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani. And he was a thinker, a theoretician. He was a forward-looking, futuristic man who wanted to address the colonial relationship that Western Europe had with the Muslim world. And he went from capital to capital. It's not that he was just all theory. He would come up with his theories. He went from Afghanistan, he went to Persia, he went to India, he went to Moscow, he went to Egypt, he went to Paris. And he debated these ideas with the top theoreticians of his time. And so therefore, he addressed the issue of nationalism and all that. So he has a very expanded and very extensive theory, and it is future forward-looking concept of how to address the ills of the society. But because they both take their roots from religion, for the West it doesn't matter. We lump them together. And there's one more thing. The first one, the Wahhabis, they are divisive. They are against the Shias and against that. It's more like sectarian and very parochial. It evolved in the middle of the Arabian desert. Whereas the second one is very different. But which one do we support? We generally support the divisive one, not the progressive one. Because in the progressive, the Muslim world would unite, of course. And that's why at the end of his life, said Jamaluddin, because he was such a prolific writer and a great speaker, his punishment was to cut his tongue. Media speech control, I think. So I think when we put all of this together, we get into a point where the revolution, like I explained in the Arab Spring, that it's difficult to define them in terms of one or two parties. Take the Syrian conflict, for instance. There was a time when the Syrian Arab Revolution was a Syrian revolution. People wanted change. They demanded a change from their new president, newly appointed president, which are hereditarily appointed. If I coined a word here, forgive me for that. I mean, that's succession is hereditary. I mean, there's no difference between a king and a president. All presidents are the sons and brothers of other presidents. When they had their expectation was not met, they resorted to peaceful protest, which is a very legitimate and quote-unquote civilized way of doing that. But because so many other conflicts were involved, remember the security of Israel, keeping Arabia safe from any upheavals politically and all that, and making sure that none of the cohesive Islamist movements come to the foreground. Because of that, I think I could show you this in one slide. If we can move on to the next one, probably show you're tired. Now, explain that. If you look at the video, if you look at the very top, you see the words are written in three colors. So the red ones are economic interests, the black ones are political alliances, and the blue ones are ideological affiliations. The color designation has nothing to do with the Democrats and Republicans. Now, the arrows are either broken dotted lines, which is deterrence, and the solid lines are influences. And if we start here at Saudi Arabia, so the world is upside down, we go up that instead of coming down this way. So Saudi Arabia has Wahhabism or Salafism, and the relationship here is that Saudi Arabia the government gets legitimized by this religious movement. And in return, the government then gives the movement all it wants to, a free hand in affairs, even external. Now, can I link that with the United States, where we have the Saudi Arabia is supporting the United States, and by support I mean is in terms of the oil resources, if there's an economic connection. And the United States, in return, accepts Saudi Arabia, no matter how draconian its policies. There are two states in the Middle East that the United States supports totally unconditionally. One, I'm sure you know, is Israel, but the other one is Saudi Arabia, that they were given a free hand. And then Wahhabis then operate within Pakistan and Afghanistan. They deter Iran, a Shia-Sunni conflict there. They support the Sunnis in the Syrian conflict. And when we come to Syria, then we can see that it's supported by Turkey, supported by Iran on the government side, because they're the Alawites. And it's a whole mishmash. But then what you see in reality is that the voice of the average Syrian calling for a change, for a legitimate change, is lost. It's not there. Now, how much of this is an Arab Spring? Not really. And so, like I said, the contrast could be made with the Eastern Europe, how much we resist. And so the conflict here is that as much as there are parties that want change, there are other parties that don't want change, and they all have their reasons, ideological reasons, political reasons, economic reasons. And so that's why if you go through some of the more other slides, this is lines in writing. Next, please. And this shows the amount of oil we import from Saudi Arabia, which is that little circle over there. Next one. This also, Saudi Arabia 12.6, and the rest is from elsewhere. The next one, we compared that thing with China, which is much more diverse as far as the Middle East goes. Next slide. This is how much profit we get our corporations, and this is for 2011, at a time that economically we suffer so much, and they are also on top of this given tax breaks, which will probably in the next slide, and we're talking about billions of dollars, and these are the 5 big oil corporations that get all the tax breaks on top of the cash reserves they have, on top of everything else, and yet the economy suffers. Next slide. That's another break. Next, please. Okay, and that shows the dependency that it's supposed to be coming down. Next one. I think that also, it depends on, where the profit comes from. So the national interest in terms of imports is secondary. Primarily it's the corporations who determine, and of course the US government follows. And so when you look at all of this, the Arab Spring looks more like the next one. If you can't see it, I can't see it. Thank you.
Thanks, and I like it. So that you can do that. Each person only gets to ask one question. No follow-ups. This is not a press conference. So, okay, do we have any questions? Yes.
This is Dr. Stanizai. If I understood you correctly, you said that the proportion of oil we get is out of proportion to the profit we get from Saudi Arabia. Is that right?
I'm not only questioning the proportionality, but I'm also saying that the way it's presented to the people, like this is a matter of life and death, survival.
But what you're saying, though, really is that it's the profits to the corporation that's influencing the decision. And I guess I do have this. Do we not get such great profits from the big sources of our supplies?
We don't get them.
Oh,
they get the profit, and they park them in Cayman Islands and elsewhere. That the latest report was 32 trillion, not billion, $32 trillion have been parked in Cayman Islands by these big corporations, and they pay zero tax on it, unlike you and I.
I'll follow up with it.
Okay, any more questions? You.
Well, the question about what is the role of fundamental Christianity or Islam in a modern society, it definitely is anti-science. It's anti-gay. It's anti-woman. All right. Do you think there's any possibility that these fundamentalist religions that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years can evolve, or are they going to obstruct modernity?
I think it's an interesting question, especially in regards to my recent research. I'm studying religion and politics in the millennial generation. A new study was recently released by the Pew Forum that 1 in 3 people of the millennial generation are religiously unaffiliated, and a good majority of these moved from an affiliated religion as a child into an unaffiliated status. I think what's going to happen is that these religions are going to be made into something else, that youth practitioners are going to maintain basic tenets and yet move away. Many of the studies that I'm looking at now and the research I'm conducting seem to suggest that 2 of the most important issues for youth today within the millennial generation are science, especially in regards to the church stance on evolution, and marriage equality and the church's stance on homosexuality. So I think that what we're going to see in the next 50 years as we settle some of these questions is that religious fundamentalists will become even more fringe, and that eventually the religion that they're looking at will not be the same, that we're going to see more moderate religion. And I wouldn't be surprised to see even more, as we get more faith-blended religious households, that religion looks completely different in 50 to 100 years than it does now.
Sir.
Respond to that.
Oh, yeah. Do anyone respond to you?
I think we often lump Islam, Christianity, and Judaism as the Abrahamic faiths, but I think the Quran stands out in the sense that it's a Quranic imperative to accept that which stands to reason. And therefore, when the first theory of evolution, which is harking back on what you say, when the first theory of evolution, for most of you who may not be familiar with, when it came out in the year 950 in the Muslim world, It was neither controversial, and people even questioned the authenticity and originality of the thought, because all over the Quran they are saying, yeah, go out to the nature and see humans and animals and plants and all that. So it did not become controversial because Islamically, Islam would have to accept Darwinism as a theory. It's not contradicting the Islamic religious beliefs. It's not contradicting the Quran itself. So Quran in that sense is scientific to the extent that we often validate science through Quran and not the other way around, which might surprise many of you, but that's the Quranic stand. Now what the Muslim society does in general, there's I think a role reversal that the Christians of the Dark Ages had certain quote-unquote behavior that has been adopted by the Muslims of the 21st century, and vice versa, because the whole Islamic civilization was based on science, whether it came from East or West, and I think that distinction had to be made.
The gentleman with the microphone.
Yes. I was wondering, is the term religious fundamentalism well chosen? I have to think that religion or advocates of religion are fundamentalists in the sense that they believe they require possession of certain basic truths that are unquestionable and unchallenged. So why use the term religious fundamentalism for all people religious fundamentalism, because it looks that fundamentally they're more important?
Absolutely, I understand the question, and the term can be considered pejorative by some. However, it is the reliance to the point of ignoring evidence in the fact of, for instance, a reliance on the written account of God created the world in 7 days in Genesis that kind of speaks to a certain stubborn obstinance to rely on one's fundamentals, or to ground fundamentals into a sort of plane that does not allow for modern interpretation or modern critical theories. It is chosen in some way because it is the accepted term, and so in order to communicate to a broad audience, when you say a religious fundamentalist, there is a certain connotation, and that is the connotation that I invite people to take when they listen to this speaker.
The lady in red.
I was a student at the American University of Beirut in the early 50s, and I still receive the main days. I see what's going on in Beirut and in Lebanon and the Middle East these days through the eyes of the people who are at AUB. I remember in the 50s that Nadab was alive and well, and it's kept going, and I still see vestiges of it in the publications that I received. And just as a matter of interest, I did happen to go to the American University of Cairo, where Hussein was giving a lecture. So it was a marvelous period, but it was a long time ago. But what do you think is happening to Nadab today? Is there still something continuing? I see vestiges of it, but
I think that's really, really interesting, and that's actually where I'd like my research to go. With the little reading that I've done with Ahmed Edmond and some other colleagues over there, a friend of my mother who's actually here, a fellow professor of Latin, a colleague of hers, teaches Virgil in the university at Cairo, and they actually have all of their students make their own translations. They do not rely on a text. Their texts are their own translations, which I can't even imagine. It's incredible. But so from that reading that I've done, that was what was most striking to me, is when I was reading Professor Etman's essay, was you hear Taha Hussein in there. You hear the Nahda in there. And I think what's interesting is him bringing in this argument of universalism. But I do wonder, how much more the Nahda could grow if we went beyond this pan-Mediterranean or even universal view to ask the question a little bit more angrily, who does let's not ignore the colonial past. Who does classical antiquity belong to? I think it is maybe a little easy to say that it's universal. So yes, the vestiges of Nahda are certainly there. And there's many questions that continue to be asked and are being asked by academics, but I hope that I can write more and provide a better answer to that question, because I think it's a very important one.
Just one more question. You've tried before.
I just had a question for Professor Stanizai. I don't know if I said it.
Ma'am, take the microphone there. We can all hear you.
Yes, I was wondering what your thoughts were. I know your presentation was kind of a general explanation of the events and of the so-called Arab Spring. I was wondering what you thought of the pretext for the intervention, or more matter of fact, the war in Libya, and the assertion by some observers or insiders that, in fact, Gaddafi had done nothing to his people, had actually not hurt any of his people, and that this was just conjured as a kind of a wag the dog creation by the West as a ruse for taking over. Then, in fact, the main reason why they intervened was because Gaddafi wanted to go off of the dollar and into the gold standard.
I think going off the dollar to the gold standard or the euro was also a reason for Saddam Hussein's downfall. But look, when the United States threatened that there should be no nuclear Muslim state, Gaddafi's was the first regime that said, okay, I give up everything I had, and Libya will not be a nuclear state. And so Libya was welcomed. It was, I think he pitched a tent outside the Champs-Élysées, and he was received in Rome with fanfare that would be befitting emperors, and because everybody wanted now, they accepted Libya as a great investor in the European economy because they had money. Everything was going fine. The problem started was, like I said, is that messing up of the contract, the $6 billion contract. So the end result was that they wanted to make sure that if the transfer, first that the transfer does occur, and that's why France went to the Security Council and say that that Gaddafi had to be brought to the International Court of Criminal Court, I think. So in a way, when his back was to the wall, there was nothing else he could do except to fight. And I've analyzed this, and I have two blogs. I think one is in Huffington Post, and they could be both gotten from my website. It's a little too detailed, but they wanted to make sure that whoever replaces Gaddafi would be someone who would be beholden to the West, so that when we are getting contracts signed, then that will be achieved. Because look, the most vilified states in the Middle East, in terms of whether it's this Arab Spring or events before that, are the states that have nationalized their resources. That's why we target them. Enemy number one, Iran, nationalized its oil in 1953. Enemy number two, remember the Axis of Evil. They nationalized their oil in 1958. Enemy number three, Gaddafi is vilified, was vilified in many ways. He nationalized his oil. Now, the first act we did in Iraq, well, free market, most of these are American corporations that I showed on the screen. So it boils down to oil. And what was it, Operation Liberation of Iraq may have been presented in other ways, or of Libya. But everything is to make sure that the person who takes charge after the revolution is someone who would still be beholden to the West. And that's why I'm talking about the robbing of the political legitimacy of the Arab Spring.
Okay, it's an interesting topic, but I think we're going to have to stop there. It's been an extraordinarily interesting and provocative panel. Thank you very much.